Recently, I read two very interesting autobiographies. One is from Indra Nooyi. Everyone is familiar with Indra Nooyi, PepsiCo, uh, and Inderjit Khanna, who retired as Chief Secretary of Rajasthan and wrote an autobiography about 12 to 15, I think, different roles that he held in his lifetime as a civil servant. Of course, we are very familiar with the autobiographies of many other people, like one Professor Bhomik, who had written Code Name God, or I'm told, I have not seen this, but Monte Olovalia, or heard speeches about their own parts of their life stories from Nadella, Microsoft, or Sundar Pichai, or film actor Anupam Kher, written a book, as well as I had the good fortune of listening to his talk at Ahmedabad Management Association. When you listen to these autobiographic accounts or videos or read a book, you are quite inspired by the kind of narrations they give. Normally, most of these contain a series of incidents at different parts of their life. Childhood, the way the parents may have treated them, the teachers, their schooling, their college, their first job, later job, and kind of challenges they faced, or what Bennis and Thomas call as crucible experiences. These are all very interesting things, and then they're inspiring. And it gives us a lot of wisdom about what are the competencies demonstrated by these great people. I've been using in our programs in competency mapping. In fact, my colleagues at TVRLS also keep using this as a mechanism of teaching mapping of competencies of individuals. Now, in this video, I would like to differentiate the competency mapping of individuals from the competency mapping of a role, and also differentiate both these from the competency mapping for a role in a given context. All competencies are, of course, contextual. When you read the entire autobiography of an individual like Indra Nooyi, or soon we are going to release our book by Arvind Agrawal, who earlier worked with RPG Group and also was president of the National HRD Network at one point of time. We have outlined 30 leaders, largely HR leaders from across the country, those who have been chosen by us on the basis of a number of criteria. And in relation to each leader, we have almost documented about 15 to 20 pages of their life story. Actually, our interviews resulted in almost anywhere between 25 to 80 pages of history, but we condensed it. And soon this book will be there containing these 30 life stories of people. So whether you read a book of Inderjit Khanna or Indra Nooyi or some of these short stories of people, it is possible to look at the entire life and identify the list of activities they have done or experiences they have gone through, and from this decipher the indicators of competencies and classify the kind of competencies they have demonstrated. For example, those of you who heard this story by Anupam Kher, you will all remember that one competence he constantly, consistently talks about and demonstrated is how do you manage failure, where he narrates the story of how he was promoted to another class, but now the results were not declared, and a couple of months after he was promoted, the results were declared. When his father came, and in the evening, since he happened to know the result earlier, and took him out for coffee in Shimla, Alpha restaurant in Shimla, and then offered him nice coffee, snacks, and at the end of it, when Anupam Kher asks his father, Daddy, why are you giving this treat for me? He said, I am giving this because you have failed in the current class, so you'll have to go back and sit in the previous class. And Anupam Kher says that, look, I am surprised that if I have failed, why are you celebrating it? He said, I am celebrating your failure so that you will never be afraid of failure in future. Then he narrates a number of incidents in his life as an actor, how he faced failures and how he didn't get disappointed. He learned from this kind of a thing and so on. So this is ability to manage what we nowadays call as resilience, or managing failures, is a competence that you derive when you listen to this story. Like this, when you listen to Indra Nooyi's stories, you will find again the resilience, particularly demonstrated in terms of managing career demands from the family demands, particularly when she had children and then they needed attention. What are all the kind of things that she had done and things like that. So that's the competence. So when you read the entire autobiography of an individual and then start listing the variety of activities, you'll have to list all the critical activities that the person has been able to face and how the person responded, positive or negative, it doesn't matter. And then see the way the person responded, what is the kind of competency demonstrated, indicators of competency. So a critical incident followed by indicator, what does it indicate, the way the person has dealt with this particular kind of an incident, and then what is the underlying competence that is revealed. So you can, there is a whole system of mapping the competencies from the biography, more or less similar to what we use it in behavior event interviews. You here only difference is in BI is a structured or semi-structured interview where you start with high points and low points, whereas I think in an autobiography, high points, low points, they are all there by the individual. Same way in the book that Arvind Agrawal and I will be bringing out soon, Leaders in the Making, there are a lot of crucible events that are narrated, because that is how I think our interview schedule talked of at various stages of life, what are the kind of crucible events that they have come across and so on. So when you look at the entire lifespan of an individual, you can identify the incidents followed by indicators of competencies and followed by the kind of competencies that the individual has demonstrated. At the end of it, you may come across maybe 20 competencies, 30 competencies, whatever are the, I think you categorize them, and then, so this is what you can say this particular individual has demonstrated in his or her life, these 15-20 competencies and things like that. Same is the case with, let's say, when I read Inderjit Khanna's autobiography, the flashes from his life, which was recently released both at IIM Ahmedabad and later in a private function by Amitabh Bachchan and so on. You find so many interesting competencies. One thing is his dutifulness. He is very dutiful and he takes whatever has been offered to him without complaining. And the way he managed his family and children along with the demands of the civil service and things like that, and his honesty, his sincerity, and his not his principled way of behaving, doing things and so on. Like I was very impressed about, I think one of the things he brings out when he was ED, Enforcement Director, when he was appointed for a year in Delhi. I think one competence which he brings out all through those 3-4 pages of his narration is the ability to deal with press, where you have to manage your role. You cannot reveal certain kind of things. All that you can do is to give whatever is information that is possible to be given in the public domain and things like that. So friends, autobiographies are excellent ways of identifying competencies of an individual. But this is only for inspiring people, developing people. This will probably have less relevance except in leadership development, in generic leadership development. For companies, they are more interested in competencies required to perform a role. That is where our TVRLS designed and in a way invented role set based competency mapping, RSBCM, role set based competency mapping, where we interview the role holders, identify with their help what are the critical activities to be performed by the individual, what is the knowledge, attitude, skills, values, motives, etc. required, and then group them into certain kind of competencies and so on. So this technique of interviewing the role holders and their role set members and documenting this and then deciphering the competencies required to perform that role effectively is what we use in competency mapping of a role, of a particular kind of a job. But in the absence of that, sometimes we also interview some successful people who have performed that particular role, and in a structured form ask them, when you performed the role, what are some of the activities you have done, what are the critical events that you have handled, and how did you react to this, and so on. So you have successful people, less successful people, and identify the competencies. You can differentiate. This is more a research based kind of a competency mapping in relation to successful performance of a role by a group of individuals. But if you don't have the group, then I think you have to resort to role set based competency mapping. So we talked of competencies of an individual using autobiographies or biography, entire biography lifespan, or using the role set members for a particular role in any organization, which will run into, I think, quite a few pages, and you require competency mapping for each one of the roles in the organization and so on. So these are two forms of competency mapping: competency mapping for individuals and competency mapping for a given role in an organization at a given point of time. Now, at a given point of time, when you map the competencies, you can also add to that what will be the future requirements and things like that. But there is a third part, which I think is the most interesting kind of a thing. Competencies required by an individual to perform a role successfully at a given point of time. Now, we are looking at whether a particular person performing that particular role at a given point of time. So and so, for example, is GM, General Manager Logistics, or Manager Logistics, or Manager Accounts, Manager so and so, a particular person performing this particular role. And we want to map the competencies of this individual. So that is where you use BI, you use psychometric tools, you use a whole lot of things, and then at the end of it, you decipher the competencies that are required. But you can't conclude on the basis of one or two individuals. You will have to have many individuals. Even if you want to have from one individual, you will have to pick up successful individuals, and from their mapping of competencies, you will have to decipher the competency requirements. So we are talking of, therefore, mapping competencies of any given individual like Indra Nooyi or Inderjit Khanna or Professor Bhaumik or Anupam Kher or 30 of the leaders that we have covered in our book. I have in another book, I have covered the competencies of about 100 managers in a book called 100 Managers in Action. And in my book, other book on effective people, I have deciphered the competencies. Of course, is in a broad way required to be a successful social worker, successful civil servant, a good teacher, and things like that, by taking up the case histories and so on. One could have gone into depth and so on. So competency mapping can be for an individual, can be for a profession, or can be for a role, or can be for an individual in relation to the role. What method you choose for mapping competencies will depend upon what is the kind of purpose for which you are going to use competency mapping. Normally, organizations are interested in competency mapping for roles. And for promotion purposes, they want to assess the competencies of a given set of individuals occupying a current role but being considered for the next higher role. So there you map the competencies in relation to the next higher role, but of the competencies of the individual using multiple techniques, which we do in assessment centers. Use management games, psychometric testing, BI, put them through some kind of a simulation exercise and so on. So there are so many forms of competency mapping and competency assessment. Particularly when you are talking of mapping competencies of an individual, you are really talking of competency assessment. Whereas mapping competencies of a role, you are talking of only outlining, deciphering, mapping, creating the contours of the competencies that are required. I hope I have clarified some basic things in competency mapping. This is just out of interest. Particularly, I am trying to relate with the kind of books that I have written in which a lot of stories are there which can be used for competency mapping. You write your own autobiography, make a lengthy one and give it to a competency expert. to map your competencies. That will be fun. Thank you for listening to this long talk.